As human beings, we all know we're going to die, but you never think it's going to be today. You know that chilling realization from Passenger Valley Collins captures the exact moment ordinary life just completely shattered on January 15th, 2009. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're walking through one of the most astonishing aviation events in human history, and we're going to do it using the exact words of the people who actually lived it.
We're looking at the miracle on the Hudson. But we aren't just going to look at the technical landing, as incredible as that was. Instead, we're breaking down the raw, chronological survival arc of U.S. Airways Flight 1549, straight from the perspectives of those who were trapped inside that cabin. Let's get right into it.
All right, Part 1, Omens and Unease. Okay, let's dive into this, because before anyone even boarded, there were these strange anomalies plaguing the passengers. For the regular commuters, the Charlotte flight was always at Gate 15, literally no exceptions. But that day, it inexplicably changed to Gate 21, which sparked this weird, immediate tension among the regulars. Then you have passenger Pam Siegel. She had a terrifying nightmare the night before about a smoking plane crashing. It rattled her so much she almost couldn't bring herself to hand over her boarding pass. And then there's Eileen Schluffer, who, on a stressed, impulsive whim, jumped in a cab to catch this earlier 2:45 flight instead of her usual 5 p.m. departure. The whole boarding process just felt incredibly rushed and agitated. It sets up this really fascinating tension between premonition and routine. Just look at Tess Sosa. She was already super anxious about her mother's upcoming surgery. When she got on the plane, her family ended up split up across different rows. She had to fight just to get someone to switch seats so her 4-year-old daughter wouldn't be sitting next to a stranger. She felt so coerced and just downright uncomfortable with the vibe of this flight that she literally stood up and announced she wanted to get off the plane, right before a flight attendant ordered her to sit down.
All that eerie buildup really culminated in these intense moments of doubt. Eileen Schliffer later said, "I had second thoughts about it. I thought, I really shouldn't do this." She felt this overwhelming sense of dread after spontaneously changing her flight. But, everyone ignored those second thoughts because, well, it's just a routine flight, right?
Which brings us to Part 2, the silent descent. The timeline of how this failed was terrifyingly fast. Takeoff felt hasty and, honestly, bizarrely quiet. Some passengers didn't even get the usual safety briefings. But the real nightmare started at exactly 3,000 feet. A massive flock of birds hit the aircraft's windshield and wings. Sparks started flying from the engines, followed almost immediately by a complete dual engine failure. And then, just this terrifyingly complete, eerie weightlessness and silence. And this brilliantly illustrates just how insanely fast everything changed. At barely 3,000 feet in the air, the nightmare was fully underway. Passengers heard these loud booms that sounded almost like heavy tennis shoes tumbling around in a dryer. The plane violently shuddered. And then came that awful, unmistakable smell of an electrical fire drifting through the cabin. One 4-year-old girl actually started crying, begging her dad to make the smell go away. Then, the absolute unthinkable happens. The engines completely stop. Passengers said you could have heard a pin drop. Brad Wenzel looked out his window, saw sparks, and then nothing. The plane lost all its forward momentum, and everyone inside felt this deeply sickening sense of weightlessness. There's no engine roar anymore, just absolute haunting silence. They had completely lost all control. Let's move into Part 3, Brace for Impact. This is the captain, brace for impact. Those were the only words the passengers heard from Captain Sully Sullenberger. Flight attendant Doreen Welsh later pointed out something chilling. You do not hear those words and live to talk about it afterwards. Hearing that specific command meant, without a shadow of a doubt to everyone on board, that they were facing certain death. The sheer terror inside that cabin was paralyzing. Doreen Welsh was initially so overcome by fear she just wanted to be left alone to pray, but thankfully her training kicked in and she suddenly heard her own voice chanting these mechanical commands: brace, brace, heads down, stay down. Meanwhile, all around her, passengers were making these desperate, frantic phone calls. Eileen Schleffer managed to get through to her husband just long enough to say they were crashing, tell him to take care of their daughter, and say her absolute final goodbyes before the line went completely dead. I want to pause here for a second and just ask you, what does it actually feel like to accept your own death? In those final horrific seconds, Jim Whittaker, sitting right next to a terrified Tess Sosa, calmly offered to take her infant son just so the baby would be in a stronger man's arms for the brutal impact. And passenger Barry Leonard, who had been anxiously waiting on his wife's cancer results back home, he silently made a deal with God, praying, "If you're going to take anybody, please take me."
Here is part 4, chaos in the cabin.
Let's walk through the exact steps of what happened the millisecond they hit the river. Step 1. A violently vibrating, almost slow-motion impact that literally ripped a piece of metal angle iron straight up through the floor and into a flight attendant's leg. Step 2. The cabin instantly fills with this overwhelming claustrophobia. The window seals break, and freezing, rushing river water pours in, rising from their ankles to their chests in a matter of seconds. Step 3. A completely frantic climb over the seats. The aisles were instantly jammed, forcing these terrified people to literally waddle and crawl over the tops of the seatbacks just to reach the wing exits before the plane went under. Now, the crucial takeaway here is this absolutely wild contrast in human behavior during a disaster. It's the herd's panic versus the individual's focus. While a screaming crowd inexplicably started opening overhead bins to grab their luggage, yes, their luggage, while freezing water is pouring in, passenger Brad Wenzel got hyper-focused. He aggressively started directing traffic, screaming at people to drop their bags and move. He even waded backwards into the flooding plane to rescue Tess Sosa, who had completely frozen in sheer terror clutching her baby. Moving on to part 5, the freezing Hudson. 155. That is the number of souls standing shoulder to shoulder on sinking metal wings right in the middle of a freezing river. Just imagine that surreal, horrifying scene for a second. Blistering winter wind, the overpowering, sickening stench of jet fuel everywhere, and the absolute certainty that the plane right beneath your feet is sinking into the dark water. And just as they thought help had finally arrived, a secondary terror struck. A massive commuter ferry pulled up to rescue them, but it couldn't stop its momentum in the water. It aggressively clipped the plane's wing. This sparked a massive wave of screams as the boat nearly crushed the survivors, knocking exhausted, hypothermic passengers right back into that heavy, mud-like freezing river. So, the crucial point here is the raw, unbelievable heroism that emerged from that chaos. Rescue swimmer Michael Delaney literally leaped out of a hovering helicopter directly into the freezing river. He found a severely hypothermic passenger who was barely hanging onto a cargo net as the ferry reversed. He grabbed her and said, "My name's Michael, and I'm going to get you out of the water." He had to force her to trust him, to let go of that net, and he swam as hard as he humanly could to pull her away from certain death. Finally, part 6, the miracle's aftermath. There's a really stark contrast we need to talk about here. The media almost instantly dubbed the event this joyful, triumphant miracle on the Hudson, but the actual reality inside the rescue marina, it was so much darker. A doctor on the scene described passengers who were utterly in shock. Some were actively hallucinating, one was bleeding internally, and so many others were just sitting there with blankets wrapped around them, completely frozen in these silent, vacant stares. The physical survival part was over, sure, but the severe psychological trauma, that had really just begun. Yet, even amidst all that deep, psychological wreckage, there was this overwhelming, truly life-altering sense of gratitude. Exhausted, freezing, and wrapped in a Red Cross blanket, Brad Wenzel looked dead into a news camera and delivered this famous line, "This pilot is the reason my daughter still has a father." Against all odds, every single one of those 155 people made it out alive that day. Which brings us to a deeply provocative question I want to leave you with today. If you survived the impossible today, how would it change your tomorrow? Having a brush with death irrevocably alters your perspective. Just like the survivors noted, it's a stark, violent reminder that we are still here, and there are other, way more important things we need to do with this life. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I will catch you on the next one.